Hello and welcome to Lamplighter. Today is October 21. Today in our daily Bible reading, we continue to read the amazing narrative of Jesus' birth. The time has come for God's plan to reach its pinnacle, the time where God himself will appear in the flesh. Remember, we read earlier in John's gospel, at the beginning of his gospel, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. We know that God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit are all present when the world is first created. And yet we also know from John's gospel in John chapter 1, by the time we get down to verse 14, that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, John writes. And we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So Jesus comes to the earth, God in the flesh, Emmanuel, God with us. Now, yesterday in our reading, we saw Luke's account of the birth narrative. And remember, we talked earlier about this chronological Bible and how the story of Jesus is going to be sort of melded together, a harmony of the Gospels, so to speak. But it's very important that we also understand the defining and differentiating characteristics of each of the Gospels as well. Matthew tells a completely different version of the story of Jesus' birth than does Luke. And typically people, when talking about the birth of Jesus' story, they combine all these pieces together and they don't necessarily completely fit because they're being told at different times around the birth of Jesus. For example, it is not uncommon near the end of the year for people to see nativity scenes, pictures, or even yard art with the manger scene and Jesus, the baby, being there laying in a manger with Joseph, and Mary standing nearby looking at him. And the shepherds have gathered there, and the wise men have gathered there. But you see, the wise men are not spoken about at the stable, in the manger, in the scene with the shepherds. None of that happens with the wise men. Today's reading shows us the wise men. These are astrologers from the East, and these come from Matthew's account. Matthew is writing at a different time, a different perspective around the birth of Jesus. So when you see those nativity scenes, the wise men were never there. We'll see more about that in just a moment. So the reading today opens with the news of these astrologers, these stargazers, if you will, who notice a very unusual star. They follow this star, and it leads them to Jerusalem, and they meet with King Herod there, who is the ruler at this time, and they say they've come from a far distance to worship he who was born King of the Jews. And as they're speaking, when King Herod hears this, he is disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. And so he called together all the chief priests and teachers of the law, and he asked them where the Christ was to be born. And they answer him, and this is based on the prophets, "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel." This is a quote from Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. So these wise men surrounding Herod know something about the prophecies, and they know that Jesus is to be born in Bethlehem. So Herod sends these wise men, these magi, on their way to go on their journey to worship this Christ child, and he feigns interest in that. He says, "I tell you what, why don't you go find exactly where he is and then come back and let me know? Because I'd like to go see him too. I'd like to worship him as well." Well, we know that Herod is a very jealous king. We know that historically as well, that Herod is one who is always very defensive and doing anything in his power to protect his authority, to protect his position. And so Herod, when he hears about this baby born, who is born according to the prophets to be king of the Jews, he knows that he's king of the Jews. He doesn't want this threat. So he's really not interested in worshiping Jesus. He's interested in destroying Jesus. Well, as you may remember from the reading, the wise men then follow the star and it stops over the house, not the stable, not the manger, but a house where Joseph and Mary are staying. And they come in and present to Jesus their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, we don't know exactly how many of these astrologers or wise men there are. Sometimes it is assumed that there are three because there are three gifts, but that doesn't indicate how many men there are. They bow down, they worship him, they tell their story, which again, Mary treasures and ponders in her heart all these things that are happening. Then they assume when they're finished, they're going to go back and report to Herod, but they're warned in a dream not to go back that same way, and so they go home a different route and never go back to Herod. Well, Herod eventually understands that he's been double-crossed. He knows that they're not coming back, and so then he starts to calculate. He surrounds himself with others that are kind of calculating the time of when the star appeared according to these astrologers and trying to calculate how long it would have taken them to get where they're going and to find the Christ child. And based on all these calculations and time periods, he decides that he's going to destroy all the baby boys throughout the land from age 2 and below, just to make sure he's covering all his bases. He doesn't want this Christ child to exist. And then we even have another prophetic warning. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. This is specifically talking about Herod's edict to kill all of these baby boys. Well, of course, Jesus himself and his family are being protected. They've already been warned in a dream not to go back to Jerusalem, not to go back to Bethlehem, but instead, because Herod is ruling there, they are going to go elsewhere. They're going to go back to Nazareth, so to speak. And Jesus is going to be raised in Nazareth as a Nazarene. And so they avoid all of the killing that is going on by King Herod. They avoid his edict, and Jesus and his family return to Nazareth, and there he's raised. His father, Joseph, his earthly father, Joseph, is a carpenter, and Jesus learns the carpentry trade with his father. Then we kind of advance in time to a point where Jesus is 12 years old. We really don't know much about his childhood other than this one scene in his life when he's 12 years old and he goes with his family to Jerusalem for a feast. And while he's there, he starts to engage some of the rabbis and the priests in discussions of spiritual matters. Meanwhile, his family has worshiped, they have offered their sacrifices, and they've begun to caravan home. And somewhere along the way, they start to recognize that Jesus is nowhere to be seen. He is not among the relatives as Mary starts to look for him frantically and asking others if he's with them or if they have seen him, and they have not. So they turn their caravan around, they go back to Jerusalem, searching and searching for Jesus, and finally he is found, and he's there in the temple. He's on the steps of the temple visiting with these prophets and priests and teachers of the law, these people who seem to be knowledgeable about the scriptures, and he's having these discussions with them, and they are wowed at his knowledge, at his level of understanding, at his level of maturity for such a young 12-year-old boy. When Mary frantically asks him, "What is he doing? Where has he been?" he says, "Didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house? Didn't you know that I had to be about my Father's business?" And again, she treasures this in her heart. And we're told that simply over the next several years, Jesus grows in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. He grows mentally, he grows physically, he grows spiritually, he grows emotionally. Jesus develops like any other human being, except we know that he is a special person. He is God in the flesh, the fulfillment of the prophecies of old. Isn't it great to be a lamplighter? His word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. I hope you have a blessed day.